Hello, everyone. I'm John, and welcome back to ASMR True Crime Story, where I share true stories in a calm, relaxing whisper. Before we begin, press a number in the comments for me. Press 1 if you're already part of our ASMR family. Press 0 if this is your first time here. And press 2 if you want another whispered true story in the next upload. If you're enjoying the calm, please like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you don't miss tomorrow's case. Now, get comfortable, settle in, and slow your breathing. Let's begin. Philadelphia, January 26, 2011. Snow was falling hard that day. The kind of storm that covers the city in silence, soft and heavy, making the streets look calm even when something dark is waiting to be discovered. In an apartment on the 6th floor of a quiet building in Northwest Philadelphia, a young woman named Ellen Greenberg was alive for the last time. By evening, her life would end in a way that has haunted investigators, doctors, and her family for more than a decade. When first responders arrived, they found her seated on the kitchen floor, her back leaning against the cabinets. She was fully dressed in sweatpants, a hoodie, and a white t-shirt. Her left hand was holding a clean white towel, and in her chest, still lodged deep, was a knife. It was only one of 29 stab wounds covering her body. At first glance, the scene looked violent, too violent to be self-inflicted. The city's medical examiner initially agreed, calling it homicide, but within weeks, that ruling was changed. Suicide. A word that would leave Ellen's parents and friends in disbelief, and a word they have fought against ever since. How could a woman with so much life ahead of her, in the middle of preparing a fruit salad, end her life by stabbing herself again and again, even in the back of the neck? How could a locked apartment, untouched snow outside, and unanswered questions inside lead to such a ruling? To this day, the case of Ellen Greenberg is called one of the most disturbing and confusing deaths in modern American true crime. On one side, police and prosecutors. On the other, her grieving parents, joined by forensic experts who argue this was not suicide at all, but murder disguised. And so, the story begins here, in Philadelphia on that winter day in 2011 when the snow fell heavy and a life full of promise was stolen. Long before the snowstorm in Philadelphia, before the locked door, before the endless questions, there was simply Ellen, a young woman known for her light, her energy, and a smile that could brighten any room. Ellen Ray Greenberg was born on June 23, 1983, in New York City. She was the only child of Josh and Sandy Greenberg. From the start, Ellen was the center of their world. In 1994, when Ellen was just 11, the family left New York and moved to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It was a quieter place, a suburban town where Ellen could grow up with space to explore, and a community that soon came to know her well. At school, Ellen stood out not only for her intelligence, but for her warmth. Her mother, Sandy, often described her as bubbly, social, and full of life. She had the kind of personality that drew people in, making them feel comfortable, seen, and welcome. Teachers noticed her kindness, friends noticed her energy, and her parents noticed her natural ability to connect with people in a way that few others could. She was not just liked, she was deeply loved. Friends said Ellen had an infectious smile, the kind that lit up every space she entered. People remembered how easy she was to be around, how joyful she seemed, and how she could make anyone feel better just by being present. At home, Ellen had a very close relationship with both of her parents. She was their pride, their joy, and their companion. Her father worked as a periodontist, a dental specialist, while her mother worked as a dental hygienist. Together, they were a close-knit family. They spent weekends together, enjoyed sports together, and celebrated milestones side by side. From a young age, Ellen showed athletic ability as well. In school, she played softball, tennis, and golf. Her father especially loved watching games with her. Sports were not only something she enjoyed, but something that bonded her with her dad. He would later say he still wore a Penn State thon bracelet, one that reminded him of those days, as a way to feel close to his daughter even after she was gone. Ellen's natural kindness followed her into her teenage years. At Susquehanna Township Middle School and later high school, she was remembered as fun, approachable, and easy to get along with. She wasn't the type to seek the spotlight, but she always left an impression. She was a bridge between people. Friends from different backgrounds, who might never have spoken, often became close simply because Ellen had introduced them. She had that gift of connecting people, of making circles larger, and of bringing warmth wherever she went. It was clear even then that Ellen had a bright future ahead of her. She was driven, kind, and full of potential. But her parents could never have imagined that one day, all they would have left of their daughter would be memories. Memories of her laughter, her compassion, and the way she seemed to make life better for everyone she touched. As Ellen moved through her teenage years, she grew into the kind of young woman people admired. She wasn't just known for her smile or her kindness. She had a quiet determination, a sense of responsibility, and a dream for the future that pushed her forward. At Susquehanna Township High School, Ellen blended her natural warmth with dedication to her studies. Teachers often described her as organized, focused, and dependable. But she was also deeply social. She had many friends, and her presence seemed to tie groups together. She had the rare ability to make people who were very different from each other feel like they belonged in the same circle. Her parents noticed that Ellen carried herself with an ease that made others feel comfortable. She had a lightness about her, but she also had discipline. She played sports throughout high school, softball, tennis, and golf, and carried that same determination onto the field and the court. She wasn't just there to play. She wanted to do well, to give her best, and to make her parents proud. Those teenage years also brought Ellen closer to her father, Josh. Sports became one of their shared languages. They would go together to games, cheering and talking about players, making memories that Josh would hold on to long after she was gone. For him, Ellen wasn't just his daughter. She was his companion, his friend, his pride. By the time she graduated high school, Ellen already had a reputation for being dependable, bright, and compassionate. She had an easy charm that made her a natural leader, even if she never demanded the role. People looked to her because she was steady, thoughtful, and kind. When it came time for college, Ellen set her sights on Penn State University. She enrolled as a communications major with plans to become a speech pathologist. It was a field that fit her perfectly, a career where her love for people, her compassion, and her patience could be put to use helping others. At Penn State, Ellen quickly became known for her enthusiasm and energy. She even worked as a Lion Ambassador, a position that allowed her to welcome new students, introduce athletes and their families to the campus, and help out at events. She thrived in this role, combining her outgoing nature with her love for the university. She loved the atmosphere, the sports, the community, and the friendships she was building. Friends remembered her as someone who could lift anyone's spirits. One of her college roommates later said that Ellen had a way of cheering people up no matter what. Her room was always tidy. She was relentlessly organized, the kind of person who couldn't leave a task unfinished. Even if a friend walked away in the middle of chopping vegetables, Ellen would finish the job, clean the counter, and smile, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. Her neatness, her order, and her ability to stay on top of everything weren't just habits. They were a reflection of how she approached life, with care, precision, and thoughtfulness. College wasn't only about academics for Ellen, it was also about building bonds. She made friends who would stay in her life long after graduation. Friends described her as a connector, someone who brought together people from different parts of her life, introducing them until they became close friends themselves. It was another sign of her rare gift. She didn't just keep relationships, she created communities. By the time she left Penn State, Ellen had built a strong foundation. She had her degree, her friendships, her memories, and her parents' pride. But when she graduated, something shifted. Speech pathology, the career she had once envisioned, didn't feel like the path she truly wanted. Instead, Ellen felt drawn to something else, something that required patience, creativity, and compassion: teaching. This decision would change her life, guiding her toward a profession she came to love. And it would also lead her step by step toward the life she built in Philadelphia, the life she shared with a man who would one day find her in their apartment on that winter evening. When Ellen graduated from Penn State, she held her degree in communications and carried with her the hope of becoming a speech pathologist. For years, that had been her plan. It seemed to fit her, a career that blended communication with care, one where she could help people find their voices. But as time passed, Ellen began to realize something deep inside. Speech pathology was not the road she wanted to walk for the rest of her life. It didn't light her up in the way she expected. Instead, she felt drawn to something else, something that demanded patience, creativity, and a heart that could nurture others. That something was teaching. It wasn't an easy decision to shift careers. Changing direction meant going back to school. But Ellen was never afraid of hard work. She had always been disciplined, the kind of person who finished what she started, and so she made the choice to pursue her teaching credentials at Temple University in Philadelphia. During her studies at Temple, Ellen worked as a teacher's aide. She was assigned to help a child with special needs, and it was in this role that her true gift began to shine. She wasn't just good at it, she was extraordinary. She had the patience to sit quietly, the creativity to make learning engaging, and the compassion to make a child feel understood. This work confirmed what Ellen already sensed. She was meant to teach. It was her calling, her place in the world. After earning her credentials, Ellen stepped fully into the classroom. She became a first-grade teacher at Juniata Park Academy in Philadelphia. From the very beginning, she was loved. Her students adored her. Parents appreciated her. Colleagues respected her. She had the natural ability to make children feel safe and inspired. For Ellen, teaching wasn't just a job, it was a purpose. She brought energy into her classroom. She encouraged her students, celebrated their progress, and gave them confidence. Even at the end of long, difficult days, Ellen's heart remained with her children. She wanted to see them succeed, to know they were capable, to help them feel valued. Those around her weren't surprised by how well she fit into this role. She had always been caring, always been someone people could lean on. Now, that same compassion was shaping the lives of children who needed her. Her family watched her flourish. Friends saw her grow. To them, it was no surprise that Ellen was thriving in education. She had chosen a career that reflected who she was at her core, someone who wanted to lift others up. But teaching also came with challenges. It was a demanding job, one that required long hours and deep emotional strength. At times, Ellen felt the pressure, yet she continued forward, determined, committed, and proud of the path she had chosen. And as her professional life blossomed, her personal life was about to take a significant turn. A blind date, arranged through mutual friends, would bring someone new into her world, someone who would change the course of her story forever. In 2007, as Ellen was settling into her role as a teacher and building a life in Philadelphia, Her path crossed with someone new. It happened the way many love stories do, through mutual friends. They arranged a blind date, and on that day, Ellen Greenberg met Sam Goldberg. Sam came from a well-off family. He worked as a television producer for NBC and carried himself with confidence. At first glance, he seemed like the opposite of Ellen's simple, down-to-earth personality, but appearances don't always tell the full story. From the beginning, their connection seemed natural. Friends described Sam as kind and easygoing, and Ellen appeared comfortable with him. The two began dating, and quickly their relationship settled into something serious. To those around them, they looked like a strong pair. Ellen often described Sam as her knight in shining armor, while her friends jokingly referred to him as a teddy bear. He wasn't rough or cold. He was relaxed, approachable, and affectionate. Her parents, Josh and Sandy, approved. What mattered most to them was that their daughter was happy, and with Sam, she seemed to be. Sandy would later recall that Ellen looked happy, and that made us happy. Over the years, the couple grew closer. They went on trips, shared holidays with their families, and built the kind of bond that looked steady from the outside. After 3 years of dating, Sam decided it was time to take the next step. In 2010, while they were on a trip to California, Sam proposed. On the beach with the waves and sky as their backdrop, he asked Ellen to marry him. She said yes. The moment was filled with excitement and hope. Ellen couldn't wait to tell her family and friends. On the way back from the trip, she even scribbled a note to her cousin on a sick bag from the plane. "Rachel," she wrote, "I didn't have any paper, so I'm using this. I thought it would be funny. I just got engaged. I'm so excited to marry Sam." Plans began to form quickly. The wedding was set for August 13, 2011, at the elegant Hotel Hershey in Pennsylvania. Ellen was thrilled. She started talking about details: the dress, the colors, the flowers. For her, this was the beginning of the future she had dreamed of. A classroom full of students, a home with the man she loved, and the prospect of one day building a family of her own. Her friends could see how much the engagement meant to her. She was glowing, full of anticipation. She sent out save the date cards just weeks before her death, eager to share her joy with the people she loved most. It looked, to everyone on the outside, like Ellen's life was lining up beautifully. She had her career, she had her family, she had her friends, and now she had a fiancé and a wedding to look forward to. But sometimes, what appears perfect on the surface can hide cracks underneath. And in the months before her death, Ellen's story began to shift. She seemed more stressed, more anxious, and less like the carefree young woman everyone knew so well. Still, in those early months of planning, the excitement was real. Ellen was ready to walk into the next chapter of her life, a chapter she never got to see. The start of 2011 should have been a joyful time for Ellen Greenberg. She was 27 years old, newly engaged, and looking ahead to a wedding planned for that coming August. She had a career she was proud of, a fiancé by her side, and parents who adored her. On paper, everything looked perfect, but life is not always as smooth as it seems. Behind her bright smile, Ellen had begun to feel pressure building. Teaching was not just a job, it was an enormous responsibility. First grade may sound simple from the outside, but in reality, Ellen faced long days, challenges with students, and the heavy emotional weight that came with shaping young lives. One of her students had recently attempted to harm himself, and others were struggling in their classes. Report cards were due at the end of January, and Ellen carried the stress of knowing how parents might respond. She confided to colleagues that she feared one particular mother might even come after her if her child failed. Ellen tried to stay composed, but her friends and family noticed a change in her. She seemed more anxious, more weighed down. At home, her relationship with Sam continued. They still appeared close, and they had gone on a holiday with her parents just weeks before. Yet those close to Ellen later recalled that she sometimes seemed different, less independent, more hesitant, and often looking to Sam for approval over even small choices. Friends described her following him closely at gatherings, almost like a shadow, which was not how she used to be. Her family encouraged her to see a psychiatrist to help her handle the stress. Ellen agreed and began seeing Dr. Berman, who met with her several times in January. He diagnosed her with anxiety and an adjustment disorder and prescribed medication. First Zoloft, then small doses of Xanax and Ambien when the first treatment didn't seem to help. By her last session on January 19th, just 1 week before her death, Ellen told him she felt 75% better. To her family, she seemed calmer, more steady, and even hopeful. Still, some signs of strain lingered. She had asked relatives if she could move in with them for a while, though she never explained fully why. To her parents, she said she wanted to quit teaching and come back home. They thought it was mostly stress from work, and Ellen reassured them it had nothing to do with Sam. They encouraged her to wait until the end of the school year before making big changes. On the morning of January 26, 2011, Ellen spoke to her parents as usual. She left for school around 7 a.m. and made sure her students got home safely when the district closed early because of a snowstorm sweeping through Philadelphia. It was the kind of storm that kept families inside, shutting down roads and canceling plans. For most people, it was a quiet evening. For Ellen, it would be her last. After leaving school, she returned to the apartment she shared with Sam in the Manayunk neighborhood of Northwest Philadelphia. Their building was secure, with cameras at entrances and a doorman downstairs. Sam came home too, and for a short time, they were both inside together. Then, around 4:50 p.m., Sam decided to go to the gym in their complex. He left Ellen alone in the apartment, planning to be gone for about an hour. When he returned, nothing would ever be the same again. By late afternoon on January 26, 2011, the storm outside had grown heavier. Snow fell thick over Philadelphia, muffling the usual sounds of the city. The streets were quiet, and the apartment building where Ellen lived with Sam Goldberg stood still against the winter air. Inside that building, Ellen had gone home after school closed early. She made sure her first graders were safe before leaving, a final act of responsibility that showed her dedication to her students, even on a storm day. She arrived back at the apartment she shared with Sam, ready to settle in for the evening. For a short while, Ellen and Sam were both at home together. Then, around 4:50 p.m., Sam decided to go to the gym in their complex. It wasn't far, just downstairs. He left Ellen inside the apartment. The snowstorm meant there was little else to do that night, and the gym was a way to pass the time. Sam worked out for about an hour. By the time he returned, it was close to 6 p.m. He expected to walk back into their apartment, but when he reached the door, something was wrong. His key turned in the lock, but the door wouldn't open. Their apartment had two locks, a standard one and a swing bar lock, the kind often found in hotel rooms. From the outside, you could only open it if the bar wasn't latched. From the inside, it could be hooked across to block entry. That night, the swing bar lock was fastened. The door was sealed from within. At first, Sam was only frustrated. He believed Ellen had locked it and didn't understand why she wouldn't open when she knew he was coming home. He began texting her. The first message was short, then another, sharper. Soon his frustration grew. Between 5:30 p.m. and 5:54 p.m., he sent 9 texts in total. They read, "Hello. Open the door. What are you doing? I'm getting pissed. Hello. Open the door. What's wrong with you? You better have an excuse. What the hell? Each message carried more urgency than the last, but inside, there was no response. Sam began calling Ellen's phone, but she didn't answer. He knocked loudly, even shouted through the door, but the apartment stayed silent. The frustration he had felt earlier shifted into worry. Something wasn't right. He went downstairs to the lobby and asked the security guard, Phil, to help him. Sam wanted Phil to unlock the door, but the guard refused. It was against policy. No one could open a tenant's apartment for another person. Still, Phil walked back upstairs with him, though he would later tell investigators he did not stay when the door was forced open. Sam stood outside the door again, locked out, with the snowstorm still raging beyond the building's walls. He tried the handle once more, then finally kicked at the door. The frame splintered, and the swing bar lock gave way. When the door opened, the life he knew ended. Inside the kitchen, only a few steps from the entryway, Ellen was on the floor. She was seated upright, her back against the cabinets, her legs stretched out in front of her. Her head leaned forward, tilted to one side. A pool of blood spread across the floor beneath her. In her chest, buried deep, was a knife. Sam's world collapsed in that instant. Panic rushed in. His fiancée, the woman he was supposed to marry in just months, was unresponsive, lifeless. At 6:33 p.m., his shaking hands dialed 911. His voice broke with shock as he told the operator what he had found. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside that sixth-floor apartment, tragedy had taken root. The door had splintered open under Sam's kick, the broken frame giving way to a scene he would never forget. The apartment, usually so ordinary, was now a place of horror. Just a few steps inside the doorway, the kitchen came into view, and there, against the cabinets, sat Ellen. Her body was upright, her back pressed against the lower cupboards, her legs outstretched before her. Her head slumped slightly to one side. Blood pooled beneath her, dark and heavy against the light floor. Her left hand still held a clean white towel, clutched as though it had never touched the blood that stained nearly everything else around her. And in the center of her chest, rising from her sweatshirt, was the handle of a knife. It stood out, embedded deep, impossible to miss. Sam's mind struggled to process what his eyes saw. Panic overtook him. His fiancée, the woman he had planned to marry in only a few months, was unresponsive. He dropped into shock, his voice shaking as he fumbled for his phone. At 6:33 p.m., he dialed 911. The call captured his confusion, his fear, and his disbelief. At first, his words were frantic and uneven. He tried to describe what he was seeing, telling the operator that there was blood everywhere, that Ellen wasn't moving. He said he thought she had fallen, that maybe she had hit her head. In his panic, details blurred. His tone rose and fell, swinging between alarm and despair. The operator tried to guide him, asking questions to understand the scene. Was Ellen breathing? Was she responsive? Could he try CPR? Sam's answers came in broken pieces. He confirmed she wasn't moving, confirmed she wasn't responding. But when asked to give her CPR, he hesitated. He said he didn't know if he could. He sounded afraid, overwhelmed, unable to act. For a moment, he insisted she was on her back, though in reality she sat upright against the cabinets. Stress twisted his words. Then, as he leaned closer, his voice changed. He gasped and shouted suddenly. He had noticed the knife. "She's been stabbed!" he cried out, realizing the full horror of what lay before him. The dispatcher urged him again to try CPR, to press his hands against her chest and attempt to revive her. But Sam's fear was clear. He struggled, saying he couldn't, saying it was too difficult. The shock in his voice revealed a man lost in terror. Within minutes, paramedics arrived at the apartment. They rushed into the kitchen, carrying their equipment, prepared to fight for Ellen's life. But as soon as they saw her, they knew the truth. There was no pulse. There was no sign of breath. Her body was already still, already gone. At 6:40 p.m., just minutes after first responders entered, Ellen Greenberg was pronounced dead. The snowstorm outside continued to fall over Philadelphia, covering streets and sidewalks in silence. Inside that apartment, her life had ended. The plans she had made, the students she had taught, the wedding she had been preparing for, all of it was stopped in an instant. What remained was a scene that raised more questions than answers. A locked apartment, 29 stab wounds, a knife in her chest, and a mystery that was only beginning. When police officers entered the apartment that evening, they were immediately confronted with a scene that was both shocking and strangely quiet. The snowstorm outside had already created a sense of stillness in the city, and inside Ellen's home, that same silence lingered, heavy and unsettling. Ellen sat in the kitchen, just as paramedics had found her minutes earlier. Her back was still against the lower cabinets, her legs stretched out, her head tilted forward. The blood around her was dark and thick, marking the floor and staining her clothes. The white towel in her left hand was still clean, untouched by the blood that should have covered it. Her right hand, however, was clenched into a fist. The knife protruding from her chest was impossible to ignore. It was lodged deep, buried nearly 4 inches into her body. Around her, the rest of the apartment appeared untouched. Officers looked around carefully. Nothing seemed out of place. There were no overturned chairs, no broken objects, no shattered glass. Nothing suggested a violent struggle had taken place in the living room, bedroom, or hallway. Everything appeared orderly, as though Ellen had been in the middle of a normal evening before her life ended. On the kitchen counter, they noticed something unusual: a small cutting board, some blueberries, and a freshly cut orange. It looked as if Ellen had been preparing a fruit salad just before she died. The scene felt interrupted, as though someone had paused a moment of ordinary life and replaced it with something tragic. There were also other details that stood out. 2 additional knives from the kitchen block had been removed. They lay on the counter nearby, clean and free of blood. The block itself had been knocked over, resting sideways as if it had been disturbed. But there were no signs of forced entry into the apartment. The front door showed damage only from when Sam had kicked it open minutes earlier. The balcony outside was covered in fresh snow, undisturbed and without footprints. And the building itself was secure, with cameras in the lobby and at entrance. Surveillance footage showed no one unusual entering or leaving during the time Sam was at the gym. To police, the apartment looked like a locked box, sealed from the inside, no evidence of anyone else coming or going. That fact alone began shaping their thoughts. As they examined Ellen's body, another detail caught their attention. Despite the blood on the floor and on her clothing, the white towel in her left hand remained spotless. How could it be clean when she sat in the middle of so much blood? No one had an answer. It was also strange that the knife left in her chest was serrated, a type of blade that often leaves rough, jagged edges on wounds. But the cuts on Ellen's body, at least those visible at the scene, appeared smooth and clean. Still, in those first hours, investigators leaned toward one conclusion. There were no defensive wounds on Ellen's hands or arms. Her fingernails showed no sign of struggle. No DNA other than hers was visible on the knife handle. And with the apartment locked from the inside, the simplest explanation seemed clear to them. Ellen had taken her own life. By the end of that night, even before the autopsy, the word suicide began to take hold in the police reports. To them, it explained the locked door, the lack of forced entry, and the absence of defensive wounds. But for Ellen's parents, who received the devastating call that evening, that word made no sense at all. Their daughter, the bright, loving young woman they knew, could not have done this to herself. And as the days passed, evidence would emerge that made the truth far more complicated than police first believed. The day after Ellen's death, the city medical examiner began the work of uncovering the truth. On January 27, 2011, Dr. Marlon Osborne carried out the autopsy. What he found would not only deepen the mystery, but also plant the seeds of a controversy that has lasted for more than a decade. Ellen's body was examined with care. At first glance, the violence she had suffered was undeniable. She had been stabbed 29 times. 29. Some of those wounds were shallow, only a few millimeters deep. Others were devastating, cutting several inches into her body. The deepest was in her chest, where the serrated kitchen knife remained lodged, cutting through muscle and reaching vital organs. That single wound alone would have been enough to end her life. But there were many more. Stab marks covered her torso, her chest, and her stomach. There were wounds on her neck, 10 in total, each one cutting into the back of her neck from different angles. There was even a stab wound to the back of her head that caused bleeding beneath the skull. These injuries were not the kind that could be ignored. They told a story of repeated violence, inflicted again and again. Dr. Osborne also noticed something else: bruises. They were scattered across her body, on her arms, her legs, her stomach, and her neck. Some were fresh. Others were older, already in the process of healing. This suggested they had been inflicted at different times, not all on the day of her death. To the medical examiner, the bruises hinted at a pattern, signs of possible abuse that no one had spoken about before. Inside Ellen's body, the damage was extensive. One stab wound had pierced her liver. Another had cut into her stomach. Several had sliced through her chest muscles. There was even a wound that fractured a rib. And yet, what stood out most was the question of possibility. Could Ellen truly have done this to herself? Could she have driven a knife into her own body 29 times, including blows to the back of her neck and head, and still delivered the final fatal strike to her chest? When Dr. Osborne completed his work, his conclusion was firm. On the official autopsy report, he wrote the manner of death as homicide. Ellen Greenberg, he declared, had been killed by another person. For Ellen's parents, Josh and Sandy, this finding aligned with what their hearts already knew. Their daughter had not taken her own life. She had been murdered. But even as they grieved, forces were moving behind the scenes. Within weeks, that word, homicide, would be erased, replaced with another that would haunt them for years: suicide. The battle over those two words, written in black ink on an official report, would define Ellen's case from that day forward. When Dr. Marlon Osborne completed Ellen's autopsy, his conclusion had been clear: homicide. 29 stab wounds, including 10 to the back of her neck, were not the actions of someone ending their own life. Combined with the bruises on her body, some fresh, some healing, the evidence told a story of violence inflicted by another person. For a brief moment, it seemed like the truth had been recognized. Ellen's parents, Josh and Sandy, held on to that word, homicide. It gave them a painful kind of clarity, a terrible confirmation that their daughter had been attacked. But it also meant her case would be properly investigated. Then, quietly, everything began to change. Behind closed doors, meetings were held. Representatives from the Philadelphia Police Department, the District Attorney's Office, and officials from the Medical Examiner's Office came together. It was unusual for such a meeting to even take place. In fact, both Dr. Osborne and his supervisor, Dr. Gary Collins, later said they had never been asked before or since to meet with law enforcement in this way, to discuss altering the official ruling of a death. In that meeting, Police presented their reasoning. They insisted Ellen had been alone in the apartment. The front door had been locked from the inside with a swing bar latch. The balcony, 6 stories above the ground, was covered with untouched snow, showing no footprints. Surveillance cameras showed no strangers entering or leaving the building. There was no sign of forced entry. To the police, the conclusion was simple. If no one else could have entered, then Ellen must have ended her own life. But that theory ignored the violence of her wounds. It ignored the bruises on her body. It ignored the sheer physical impossibility of stabbing oneself 29 times, especially in the back of the neck and head. Still, the pressure in that room was real. Within weeks of his initial ruling, Dr. Osborne changed Ellen's official manner of death from homicide to suicide. The word that once gave her family hope for justice was erased, replaced by one that shattered them. Josh and Sandy did not hear this devastating change directly from investigators. They were not given the courtesy of a phone call, a meeting, or even a written explanation. Instead, they found out the way so many others did, through the media. For Ellen's parents, it was like losing their daughter all over again. They had already endured the unbearable grief of her violent death. Now they were being told, in public, that she had done this to herself. To them, it was unthinkable. Their Ellen, who loved teaching, who had just sent out wedding invitations, who had called her mother only days before about quitting her job and moving home, was not suicidal. She had everything to live for. The ruling didn't just wound them emotionally, it also changed the course of the investigation. With suicide written on the report, the apartment was no longer treated as a crime scene. Evidence that might have answered questions was gone forever. The apartment itself had already been cleaned by professionals, and key belongings had been collected by Sam's family. The chance to properly investigate had been lost. For Josh and Sandy, this was the beginning of a long and painful fight. A fight not only against their grief, but against a system that seemed determined to close the door on their daughter's case. And so, the story of Ellen Greenberg took on a second layer of tragedy. The first was her violent death. The second was the way her death was explained. A sudden change of story that left her family searching for answers that never seemed to come. When Josh and Sandy Greenberg learned that their daughter's death had been reclassified as a suicide, they were devastated. The word felt like a betrayal. It erased the truth they believed so strongly, the truth that Ellen had not chosen this for herself. For them, the ruling was not only wrong, but deeply unjust. They had raised a daughter who was full of life, someone who loved her students, who had been planning her wedding, who had a future waiting. To imagine that she had ended it all in such a violent and unusual way was impossible for them to accept. At first, they thought there must have been some mistake. Surely, if investigators looked closer, if the evidence was properly examined, the truth would come out. But as the weeks turned into months, it became clear that the case was not moving forward. The ruling of suicide had closed doors that once seemed open. Police treated the case as solved. The apartment had been cleaned. Items had been taken away. Evidence that might have told the real story was gone. For Josh and Sandy, grief turned into determination. They could not bring Ellen back, but they could fight for her. They could demand answers. They could challenge the story that had been written about her. They began gathering every piece of information they could: autopsy reports, crime scene photographs, police notes. They studied each detail, even though it was painful to look at. Every page was another reminder of their daughter's violent end. But they forced themselves to read because they knew the truth was hidden somewhere inside. They reached out to experts. One of the first was Dr. Cyril Wecht, a well-known forensic pathologist who had worked on high-profile cases across the country. After reviewing Ellen's autopsy, Dr. Wecht was firm in his opinion. her wounds were not consistent with suicide. He explained that while self-inflicted stab wounds do occur, they are rarely multiple and almost never to the back of the neck or head. The pattern of Ellen's injuries, he said, was far more consistent with homicide. Josh and Sandy held on to that. It was validation from someone with decades of experience. They weren't just grieving parents in denial. There were real professional reasons to doubt the ruling of suicide. But the Greenbergs knew they would need more than one voice. They continued seeking opinions from other forensic experts. Dr. Henry Lee, another respected name in the field, also reviewed the evidence and came to the same conclusion. The wounds, the blood patterns, and the overall scene were not typical of suicide. To him, it looked far more like homicide staged to appear otherwise. Each expert gave the Greenbergs strength, yet, with each passing year, the official ruling did not change. Police and prosecutors held firm to suicide, no matter how many questions were raised, no matter how many inconsistencies were pointed out. The answer from authorities stayed the same. For Josh and Sandy, this created a second layer of grief. It was not only that their daughter had died in such a brutal way, it was that the system seemed unwilling to see the truth. They were grieving parents, but they had to become investigators, advocates, and voices for justice. At times, the weight felt unbearable. The loss of a child is the deepest pain a parent can endure. To add to that, the frustration of fighting against silence, denial, and dismissal was almost too much. But Josh and Sandy refused to give up. Ellen had been their only child. She had filled their lives with love, laughter, and hope. To walk away now, to accept the word suicide written on a piece of paper, would be to let her down. And so the fight began. A long, exhausting, painful fight that would stretch over years. A fight filled with petitions, legal battles, expert reports, and countless sleepless nights. A fight not just for answers, but for the dignity of their daughter's name. For Josh and Sandy, this was not just about how Ellen died. It was about who she was. A bright young teacher, a loving daughter, a woman with a future stolen, and they would not let the world remember her as anything less. As the months passed after Ellen's death, Josh and Sandy Greenberg realized they could not rely on the official investigation. The word suicide had already been written into the record, and with it, the police treated the case as closed. If they wanted the truth, they would have to fight for it themselves. That fight began with science. The Greenbergs turned to people who had spent their lives studying death, experts who could look at Ellen's wounds with trained eyes. They wanted answers that could not be ignored, truths written in the body of their daughter that no one could erase. The first voice to join them was Dr. Cyril Wecht, a world-renowned forensic pathologist. When he studied Ellen's autopsy, his conclusion was clear. In his long career, he had seen many deaths, both suicides and homicides. He explained that self-inflicted stab wounds usually came in small numbers, often just one or two, and usually to the chest or abdomen. They were rarely numerous. They were almost never to the back of the head or neck. Ellen had 10 stab wounds in her neck alone, some of them deep, others coming from different directions. To Dr. Wecht, this did not look like suicide. It looked like homicide. The Greenbergs found strength in his words. They were not imagining things. The evidence itself questioned the official story, but they did not stop there. They sought another opinion, this time from Dr. Henry Lee, another leading expert in forensic science. Dr. Lee had worked on some of the most famous criminal cases in the world. When he looked at Ellen's file, he too was troubled. The blood patterns in the kitchen did not match the story of suicide. The number and placement of the wounds did not make sense. The towel in her hand was spotless, though blood covered her clothing and the floor. For Dr. Lee, the scene suggested something else, a death that had been staged. His words echoed Dr. Wecht's. This case looked far more like homicide. Every expert who studied Ellen's case seemed to return with the same opinion. Even Tom Brennan, a former police officer and private investigator with over 25 years of experience, could not believe what he was reading in the reports. He explained that the scene should have been processed as a homicide from the beginning, with careful collection of forensic evidence. Instead, it had been treated as a suicide almost immediately, which meant crucial testing was never done. He pointed out that Ellen had been cutting fruit before her death. Blueberries and an orange were still on the counter. Who prepares a snack, then suddenly decides to stab themselves 29 times? To him, the story made no sense. He believed Ellen had been attacked suddenly, a blitz assault that gave her no chance to fight back, which explained the lack of defensive wounds. As more voices joined the Greenbergs, the weight of doubt grew heavier. Each expert highlighted inconsistencies. Each one challenged the idea that Ellen had ended her own life. Yet, despite all of this, the official ruling of suicide remained. The police held their position. The medical examiner's office did not reverse its decision. The district attorney's office showed no interest in reopening the case. For Josh and Sandy, it was like shouting into the wind. They had science, they had experts, they had reason on their side, but still, the system refused to listen. Even so, they refused to stop. Each report, each professional opinion, each piece of evidence became another stone in the foundation of their fight. They were building a case brick by brick to prove that their daughter had not taken her own life. For them, this was not only about justice, it was about love. They owed it to Ellen to protect her truth, to fight for her memory, and to demand that the world see what they saw. A young woman whose life had been taken, not one who chose to leave. By the time multiple experts had reviewed Ellen's case and raised doubts about suicide, Josh and Sandy Greenberg knew they could not stay silent. They had already lost their only child. To let her death be recorded as a suicide, something they believed with every part of their being was false, would be to lose her a second time. The fight moved from grief-stricken conversations at home to a broader stage. It became a battle against institutions, against silence, and against a system that seemed determined to close the door. Their first step was legal. They hired attorney Larry Krasner, who would later become Philadelphia's district attorney, to represent them. Through him, they tried to push for Ellen's case to be reopened, to force investigators to look again at the evidence. Meetings were held with officials, but each time the Greenbergs were met with a resistance. Police stood by their conclusion. The district attorney's office repeated the same line. There was no sign of forced entry, no defensive wounds, and no reason to believe it was anything other than suicide. The medical examiner's office did not reverse its ruling. To the Greenbergs, it felt like doors were being shut one after another, but they refused to give up. They turned to the public. They shared Ellen's story through the media, speaking about the inconsistencies and their disbelief at the ruling. News outlets began covering the case, questioning how a woman with 29 stab wounds could be said to have ended her own life. Public attention grew, and with it came petitions, letters, and voices demanding answers. But attention alone was not enough. Josh and Sandy knew they needed to build an unshakable case, something so strong that it could not be ignored. That meant more experts, more evidence, and more time. It also meant living in constant grief. Every meeting, every interview, every document they reviewed dragged them back into the darkest moment of their lives. Each photograph, each description of wounds was a reminder of what had been taken from them. Yet they pressed on, because love gave them no other choice. As the years went by, their fight moved in and out of courtrooms. They filed lawsuits against the city of Philadelphia, against the medical examiner's office, and against those they believed had mishandled the case. Each legal filing was another step forward, another attempt to keep Ellen's name alive in the system. But progress was painfully slow. Motions were delayed. Hearings were pushed back. Officials stood firm in their position. It was as if the system was designed not to move. For Josh and Sandy, time became both their greatest enemy and their most powerful weapon. With every year that passed, they grew older, but they also grew louder. They reminded the world, again and again, that Ellen's case was not over. Their lives changed completely. Where once they were parents celebrating their daughter's career, her engagement, and her future, now they were advocates, fighters bound by a cause they never asked for. Their only mission was to make sure Ellen's death was seen for what they believed it was, a homicide. The battle for truth had begun, and it would not end quickly. It would stretch across years, across courts, across media headlines. It would take money, energy, and sleepless nights. But for Josh and Sandy, there was no other path. They had one daughter, she was gone, and this fight was the only way left to love her. As Josh and Sandy pressed forward in their search for truth, one thing became clearer with every report they read and every expert they consulted. The details of Ellen's case did not fit together. Piece by piece, the evidence revealed contradictions, facts that made the official ruling of suicide harder and harder to believe. The first detail that stood out was the knife itself. The blade lodged in Ellen's chest was serrated, the kind designed to leave jagged edges when cutting. But when doctors studied her wounds, they saw smooth, clean lines. How could a serrated knife produce wounds that look straight and sharp? The inconsistency raised serious questions. Then there was the white towel. In her left hand, Ellen had been holding it tightly, yet the towel was spotless, perfectly clean, while blood covered her clothing, the floor, and even her body. If she had been bleeding so heavily, how had the towel escaped unstained? Forensic experts said it didn't make sense. The details suggested the scene may have been staged, that the towel had been placed there after the fact. The number and location of the wounds also stood against the theory of suicide. 29 stab wounds, 10 of them in the back of the neck, 1 in the back of her head, several in her chest and abdomen. Experts pointed out that suicides by stabbing usually involve far fewer wounds and almost never to the back of the body, where it is physically difficult to reach. The directions of the wounds were also different, as though inflicted by another hand. The blood patterns in the apartment raised further doubt. On the counter and sink, only a few drops were found. The rest of the blood was confined to the floor around Ellen. But investigators later pointed out that if she had been moving, stabbing herself repeatedly, there should have been a wider spread of blood on walls, on surfaces, across the kitchen. Instead, it looked contained, as though something had interrupted the natural flow of events. Even the line of blood on her face puzzled experts. A single stream ran from her nostril across her cheek, forming a straight line back toward her ear. But Ellen had been found sitting upright. Blood does not flow sideways in that position. It suggested she had been lying on her back at some point, then later repositioned upright. If true, this was another sign that the scene might not have been what it first appeared. And then there were the bruises, 11 in total, scattered across her arms, legs, stomach, and neck. Some were fresh, others were older, already healing. They spoke of repeated injury over time. Yet no one had asked serious questions about them. Police had not investigated where they came from or what they meant. To Josh and Sandy, those bruises were silent witnesses, proof that Ellen had suffered more than anyone had known. Each of these details, taken alone, might raise doubt. But together, they formed a picture that could not be ignored. A serrated knife with smooth wounds, a clean towel in the middle of blood, 29 stabs, 10 to the back of the neck, blood patterns that didn't match her position, bruises left unexplained. For Josh and Sandy, these contradictions fueled their determination. Their daughter's death had not been a simple case. It was layered with questions, unanswered and unresolved. The official story called it suicide, but the evidence whispered another truth. By now, Josh and Sandy Greenberg had carried their grief for months that stretched into years. They had collected reports, studied the evidence, and listened to experts who agreed with what they already believed. Ellen had not taken her own life. Yet despite the weight of those opinions, the ruling of suicide remained unchanged. To the Greenbergs, it felt like a wall they could not break through. Each time they asked questions, the answers were the same. Each time they asked for a new review, they were met with silence or refusal. The more they pushed, the more it seemed that officials were unwilling, or perhaps unwilling to admit they were wrong. So Josh and Sandy turned to the courts. They filed lawsuits, not out of desire for money, but out of desperation for answers. Their goal was simple: to have Ellen's manner of death reclassified as homicide, so her case could finally be investigated properly. But lawsuits are not quick. They are slow, draining, and filled with obstacles. The Greenbergs found themselves caught in legal language, technical motions, and endless delays. Every time progress seemed near, it slipped away. What struck them most was the resistance. Instead of joining them in the search for truth, city officials defended the original ruling. They argued that the evidence supported suicide, even when confronted with contradictions that experts had pointed out. They seemed more focused on protecting the original decision than on asking whether it had been wrong. To the Greenbergs, this was not only painful, it was infuriating. It felt like a cover-up, a desperate attempt to hide mistakes made early in the case. They knew that police had treated Ellen's death as suicide from the very beginning, even before the autopsy. That decision had shaped everything that followed. No crime scene unit was called that night. No forensic testing was done on the blood, the knives, or the bruises. The apartment had been cleaned before investigators ever returned. Evidence had been lost forever. Now, years later, officials seemed unwilling to admit those errors. If they reclassified Ellen's death as homicide, it would mean acknowledging that her case had been mishandled from the start. For Josh and Sandy, it was clear. The system was protecting itself, not their daughter. In courtrooms, they sat and listened as lawyers argued over words, over reports, over definitions. They heard Ellen's name spoken again and again, but always in legal tones, stripped of the warmth and love she had carried in life. It was painful to hear their daughter reduced to a case file, a ruling, a dispute over cause and manner of death. Yet they endured it because the alternative, silence, was worse. At home, the weight of grief never lifted. Every day, Josh and Sandy were reminded of the daughter they had lost. Her room, her belongings, her photographs. They were pieces of a life interrupted. And every time they walked into a courtroom or gave an interview, they carried that grief like armor, using it to fuel their determination. The courts did not bring quick justice. The rulings did not immediately change. But for the Greenbergs, every lawsuit, every filing, every hearing was a statement. They would not stop. They would not accept what had been written. They would not let Ellen's story end with a word they believed was false. Their fight had become larger than a single case. It had become a challenge to a system that too easily closed its eyes. And so, the Greenbergs pressed forward, carrying both their sorrow and their hope, refusing to let their daughter be forgotten, refusing to let her death be misunderstood. As the Greenbergs fought their battle in the courts, they soon realized they were not alone. Ellen's story, once confined to their family and a small circle of investigators, began reaching the public, and with that, new voices began to rise in support. The media picked up her case, reporters wrote articles, news stations aired segments, and podcasts began to tell Ellen's story. Each time her case was shared, more people asked the same question. How could a young woman with 29 stab wounds, 10 of them in the back of her neck, be ruled a suicide? The contradictions caught people's attention. The clean towel in her hand, the serrated knife that left smooth wounds, the line of blood on her face that did not match her position, the bruises scattered across her body, old and new. Each detail sounded wrong, unsettling, almost impossible. For members of the public, it was difficult to imagine such a death being explained as self-inflicted. For the Greenbergs, it was both painful and encouraging to see so many people now echoing what they had been saying for years. Petitions began to circulate. One of them gathered more than 160,000 signatures, each one a name demanding that Ellen's case be reopened. People signed not because they knew Ellen personally, but because they believed in fairness, in truth, and in justice. They believed no parent should have to fight this hard to be heard. The support gave Josh and Sandy strength. It reminded them that Ellen's life mattered not only to them, but to strangers who had never met her. Her story had touched something universal, the deep human need to know the truth, and the refusal to accept what feels wrong. Still, the attention was bittersweet. Each headline, each story, each interview forced the Greenbergs to relive their loss. They spoke about Ellen over and over, remembering her smile, her laughter, her love for teaching, even as they described the brutal way she had died. They opened their wounds to the public, hoping that by sharing their pain, they might keep the fight alive. At times, the spotlight was exhausting. At times, it felt like too much to carry. But they knew Ellen's voice had been taken from her, and so they lent her their own. The more the public learned, the more pressure grew on officials. Questions were asked not just by grieving parents, but by communities, reporters, and citizens who wanted to understand. Why was there no crime scene investigation? Why was the ruling changed after pressure from police? Why were the bruises on Ellen's body never explained? For the Greenbergs, this wave of attention felt like a lifeline. They were no longer shouting into the wind. Others were shouting with them. And yet, despite the growing noise, the ruling of suicide did not change. The system remained unmoved. Ellen's death was still written down in official records, as if she had chosen it herself. This too became part of the Greenbergs' pain. To the world outside, it seemed obvious that something was wrong. But to the authorities who held the power to act, it was as though the evidence and the voices were invisible. Still, Josh and Sandy pressed forward. The petitions, the news coverage, the growing awareness, all of it mattered. It proved that Ellen's story had not been buried. It proved that people cared. And for grieving parents trying to carry the weight of both love and loss, that meant everything. The public had spoken. Thousands of people signed petitions. News outlets questioned the ruling. Experts raised their doubts. And still, for Josh and Sandy Greenberg, nothing changed. The official record continued to call Ellen's death a suicide. Each time they looked at that word, printed in coal black letters, it felt like a wound that would not heal. It was not only grief anymore, it was injustice. As the years stretched forward, the silence from authorities grew louder. Meetings ended in disappointment. Letters brought no answers. Phone calls led to the same rehearsed explanations. To officials, the case was closed. To the Greenbergs, it was anything but. This silence became its own kind of cruelty. Every day, Josh and Sandy woke up with the same ache. Their daughter was gone. Her future stolen. Her wedding dress unworn. Her classroom empty. And yet, her death was treated as though it required no further questions. Time did not soften their pain. In some ways, it sharpened it. Birthdays passed without Ellen. Holidays came and went, with an empty seat at the table. Friends' children grew older. while their own daughter remained frozen in memory. 27 forever. Still, they fought. They pushed forward even when the road seemed endless. They gathered more experts, more reports, more voices willing to speak. Each one confirmed what they already knew. The ruling did not make sense. The evidence did not add up. Ellen deserved more. But with every step, resistance waited. Documents were withheld. Requests were denied. Court motions were delayed. And again, they were told there was not enough evidence to change the ruling. And yet, how could there be enough when so much evidence had been lost or ignored from the very beginning? For Josh and Sandy, the silence was not just in the offices of officials. It was in their home too. Without Ellen, the house was quiet. The laughter she'd once filled it with was gone. Even the air seemed heavier. They carried her presence in photographs, in small belongings, in memories too painful and too precious to set aside. At night, they wondered if Ellen had tried to tell them something in those final months. The bruises no one explained, the stress she had spoken of, the moments when she had asked to move in with relatives without saying why. They replayed these fragments again and again, searching for meaning, searching for what they had missed. The silence became the shape of their lives. Silence from Ellen, silence from the system, silence where answers should have been. But even in that silence, they refused to stop. They kept speaking, they kept writing, they kept showing up in court, in interviews, in petitions. If the system would not listen, then they would force the world to hear. Because for Josh and Sandy, silence could never be the final word on Ellen's life. Years had passed, and still Ellen's death remained locked in silence. But as time went on, the Greenbergs found cracks in that silence. Small cracks at first. New experts, new lawyers, new voices who were willing to look again at the evidence. It began with private forensic specialists. Josh and Sandy had used what savings they had to hire some of the best in the field. These experts studied the photographs, the autopsy reports, the bruises, and the knife. One by one, they came to the same conclusion. Ellen's death did not fit the profile of a suicide. The wounds alone told the story. 29 stab wounds, some so deep they cut through muscle. Wounds in the back of her neck and head. Wounds on her stomach and chest. Injuries that experts said were not consistent with self-harm, and yet the ruling had never changed. One specialist, a respected pathologist, explained it in plain terms. No person in Ellen's state of mind, with her dominant hand holding a towel, could have inflicted such injuries upon themselves. It was a physical impossibility. Another noted the bruises, some fresh, some older, scattered across her arms, legs, and torso. These marks suggested repeated impact, as though Ellen had been struck or restrained. They were never explained in the official report. These findings reignited the Greenbergs' fight. With new reports in hand, they returned to court. They demanded that the ruling be changed. They demanded that someone listen. And for a moment, it seemed the system might bend. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office agreed to take a fresh look. The case was no longer buried in the files of the local district attorney. It was given a new set of eyes. The Greenbergs felt a small flicker of hope. After so many years of doors closing, this felt like one opening. Investigators began to review the evidence again. They revisited the autopsy photos, the scene reports, the medical files. Outside experts were consulted. The petitions from the public were noted. But the process was slow. Months turned into years once again. Each update, when it came, felt like a drop in an empty well. The Greenbergs were told the investigation was ongoing, but rarely did they hear more than that. In the meantime, more forensic specialists spoke out. A neurologist reviewed Ellen's injuries and explained that some of the wounds to her brain would have left her unable to move, let alone continue stabbing herself. Another medical examiner pointed out the clean towel in her left hand, saying it was simply not possible to grip it tightly while stabbing herself over and over with the other. The Greenbergs shared these findings with the world. They gave interviews. They handed reports to journalists. They spoke with anyone who would listen. They made sure Ellen's case stayed alive in the public's mind. Still, the Attorney General's office hesitated. They did not rule it a homicide. They did not reopen the case as murder. Officially, Ellen's death remained a suicide with what they called uncertain circumstances. For Josh and Sandy, this half-step felt like another heartbreak. After all the evidence, after all the experts, after all the years, their daughter's truth was still being denied. Yet even in this disappointment, they refused to give up. They told themselves and the world that they would fight until their last breath. Ellen's story deserved justice, and justice, no matter how long delayed, was still worth fighting for. More than a decade had passed since Ellen's death, and still the questions had no clear answers. The Greenbergs had grown older, but their determination had not faded. If anything, time only made their mission sharper. The case had reached the Pennsylvania courts more than once. Judges listened to arguments, read motions, and reviewed evidence. Yet time and again, the rulings leaned toward the same old conclusion, that there was not enough to overturn the manner of death. To Josh and Sandy, these legal decisions felt like heavy doors slamming shut. Each denial was a reminder of how high the walls of the system could be. Still, they did not walk away. They filed appeals. They found new lawyers. They refused to let Ellen's name be forgotten in the paperwork of closed cases. Outside the courtroom, Ellen's story had taken on a life of its own. Documentaries featured her case. Podcasts dedicated episodes to her death. News articles kept revisiting the details that made no sense. Each time the story reached a new audience, more people joined the Greenbergs in their disbelief. Yet inside the official records, little had shifted. The Attorney General's office continued to insist there was not enough evidence to prove murder. They used phrases like uncertain circumstances and complex case, words that gave the appearance of caution but left Ellen's death in the same unresolved state. For Josh and Sandy, the fight was no longer only about correcting the word written on their daughter's death certificate. It was about the larger truth, about the way justice could be delayed, resisted, or even denied when the answers became inconvenient. They wanted Ellen's story to mean something beyond their personal grief. They wanted it to stand as a warning about how easily truth could be buried beneath official silence. But even as the legal walls stood firm, the Greenbergs kept hope alive. They pointed to the long list of experts who stood with them. Pathologists, neurologists, and forensic scientists had all said the same thing. Ellen could not have done this to herself. That fact alone, they believed, would one day break through. In interviews, Josh often spoke with quiet but unshakable strength. He described Ellen's smile, her kindness, her dreams of teaching. He talked about the wedding she never had, the children she never raised. Each word reminded listeners that Ellen was not just a name in a file. She was a daughter, a fiancée, a young woman whose life had been violently cut short. Sandy, too, spoke of her daughter with both love and anger. She called the ruling a betrayal, and the system a wall built to protect itself. Yet beneath the frustration, her words carried the endless ache of a mother who had lost the most precious part of her life. The case today is more than a mystery. It is a wound that has never been allowed to heal. Every time new evidence surfaces, every time another expert raises doubts, the Greenbergs find themselves once again at the start of the same uphill battle. But still, they fight. Because for Josh and Sandy, there is no alternative. To stop would mean allowing silence to swallow their daughter's story. And silence, after all these years, is the one thing they cannot accept. When the courtrooms grew silent and the officials turned away, Josh and Sandy Greenberg kept speaking. Their voices carried Ellen's story when no one else would. They spoke not only as grieving parents, but also as the only ones who refused to let their daughter's truth be buried. In every interview, in every public statement, their words carried both love and pain. Josh often started by reminding people who Ellen was. Not just the victim of a case, but a living, breathing person. He would tell stories about her laughter, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about teaching, the patience she showed with children. He wanted the world to see her as he did, kind, gentle, and full of promise. Then he would shift to the reality that haunted them. He would describe the wounds, the unanswered questions, the contradictions that made no sense. His voice would grow tighter, his words deliberate, as though each one carried the weight of years spent fighting against silence. Sandy's voice was different, softer at times, but edged with anger that came from the deepest place in a mother's heart. She often spoke about the moment she got the call that Ellen was gone, the way her world split in two that day. She admitted to nights spent awake, staring into the dark, replaying every detail of what she had been told. She said the ruling of suicide felt like a second death, not only losing Ellen, but also losing the truth of how she died. Both parents carried the same unshakable message. Their daughter did not choose this. Someone took her life, and the system failed to admit it. Over the years, Josh and Sandy learned how to speak for Ellen with balance, to share enough pain that people felt the weight of their loss, but also enough hope that people wanted to join them in the fight. They reminded listeners that justice was not only for Ellen, but for everyone who might one day face a system unwilling to face the truth. In one interview, Sandy said quietly, "I don't want any other family to sit where we are sitting. I don't want any other mother to beg for someone to believe the obvious." Her words lingered, striking at the heart of why they kept going. Josh, too, often ended with the same promise. "We will never stop, not until the truth is spoken out loud, not until Ellen is given back her dignity." Their voices kept Ellen alive in the public's mind. Without them, the story might have faded, replaced by newer headlines. But because of them, Ellen's name continued to echo year after year, always attached to the same unanswered questions. For the Greenbergs, speaking out was more than a duty. It was their way of holding on to their daughter. It was their way of keeping her close, even as the years pulled her further into the past. Every word they spoke was a thread that tied her memory to the present. And so, while officials may have called the case closed, Ellen's parents made sure her story remained open. Their voices became the proof that love, even in its most broken form, could outlast silence. Years had passed since that cold January evening when Ellen was found lifeless in her apartment, yet her story still moved her through the world like an unfinished echo. Time did not bury her memory. Instead, it carved it deeper into the hearts of those who knew her, and even into strangers who had only come to know her name through headlines, podcasts, and documentaries. The Greenbergs had never stopped speaking. Their determination made sure that Ellen's case did not vanish into silence, as so many others had. What began as a family's desperate plea for answers had grown into something larger, a symbol of how love refuses to bow down to injustice. Ellen's legacy was not only tied to the confusion of her death, but also to the beauty of her life. Friends still remembered her as the young woman who always smiled when she walked into a room. Former students and parents remembered her patience, her way of making every child feel seen and important. Her colleagues remembered her as someone filled with energy, someone who wanted her classroom to feel safe and warm. This was the image her parents fought to protect, not just the victim of a mystery, but the bright, kind woman who had been so full of promise. Her story spread across media platforms and continued to capture attention. Podcasts replayed the details, carefully laying out the contradictions that never made sense. Documentaries highlighted the experts who stood behind the Greenbergs, insisting the official ruling could not be true. Social media discussions drew in people who had never met Ellen but felt the same unease at the unanswered questions. In this way, Ellen's story became more than a case file. It became a question the world could not easily ignore. How could a young woman suffer 20 stab wounds and still be labeled as having ended her own life? How could medical examiners and prosecutors clash so strongly over the truth, yet leave her parents to carry the burden? Every time her name was spoken, every time the case was revisited, it forced people to think about the larger system itself, about the mistakes it could make, and the people it could fail. For Josh and Sandy, that was the hardest truth to face. They had always believed in justice. They had trusted that the truth, no matter how painful, would one day be recognized. But year after year, they were reminded of how heavy the walls of the system could be. And still, they pressed on. Their fight was no longer just for Ellen, but for every family who might one day face the same battle. They wanted her story to be a warning and also a call for change. Late at night, when the house grew quiet, the weight of their loss was still sharp. No amount of interviews or public support could erase the silence of a missing daughter. But in those moments, they also reminded themselves of something else. That Ellen's spirit lived on every time someone spoke her name, every time someone refused to accept the easy answer. Her legacy was not silence. Her legacy was the fight for truth. And so, as the years moved forward, Ellen Greenberg's story remained alive, in the voices of her parents, in the questions of strangers, in the determination of experts who had refused to look away. What happened in that Philadelphia apartment in 2011 still has no final answer. But the mark Ellen left on this world is clear. She became a symbol of how love endures, even against walls that seem impossible to break. Her story reminds us that truth does not fade, even when hidden. It waits. It presses forward through the voices of those who will not stop speaking. And through Josh and Sandy, through everyone who carries her memory, Ellen's voice, though silenced that night, continues to be heard.